The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverside High School's music department. Emma Martinez stood in front of her classroom adjusting the sheet music on her desk. She had been teaching piano for 15 years, and she took pride in her ability to challenge her students. Today was the day she would assign pieces for the upcoming spring recital, and she had spent weeks carefully selecting music that would push each student to their limits. The classroom slowly filled with students, their chatter creating a comfortable buzz. Emma watched them settle into their seats, her eyes scanning the familiar faces. There was Rebecca, the overachiever who practiced 4 hours every day. There was Marcus, who had natural talent but lacked discipline. And then there was Sarah Chen, sitting quietly in the back row, her eyes downcast as always. Sarah had been in Emma's class for 3 months, and in that time, she had barely made an impression. The girl was shy, almost invisible. She arrived on time, completed her assignments with mediocre results, and never volunteered to play in front of the class. Emma had tried several times to engage her, but Sarah always gave short, quiet responses. Her playing was technically correct, but lacked passion and confidence. Emma had almost written her off as another student who would drift through the program without making any real progress. The bell rang, and Emma called the class to attention. She began handing out the recital pieces, explaining her choices for each student. Rebecca received a complex Chopin etude that made her eyes light up with excitement. Marcus got a jazzy contemporary piece that suited his improvisational style. One by one, students received their assignments, each piece carefully matched to their skill level and personality. When Emma reached Sarah's desk, she paused. She had given this considerable thought. Sarah needed something that would force her out of her comfort zone, something that would require more than just going through the motions. Emma placed the sheet music on Sarah's desk with a decisive tap. It was Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one of the most demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Sarah looked down at the music, her face going pale. The other students craned their necks to see what she had received, and whispers rippled through the classroom. Everyone knew that piece. It was the kind of music that professional pianists performed in concert halls, not something a mediocre high school student attempted. Emma saw the fear in Sarah's eyes but stood firm. Sometimes students needed to be pushed beyond what they thought they could do. She had seen it work before. The challenge would either inspire Sarah to rise to the occasion or help her realize that piano might not be her passion. Either outcome was valuable. After class, Sarah approached Emma's desk slowly, clutching the sheet music. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. She wanted to know if there had been a mistake. This piece was too difficult. She had heard professional pianists play it, and she knew she couldn't manage it. Could she please have something easier? Emma's response was firm but not unkind. She told Sarah that she believed in challenging her students. The recital was 3 months away, which was plenty of time to learn the piece. She assured Sarah that she wouldn't have assigned it if she didn't think it was possible. What Sarah needed was confidence and dedication. This piece would help her develop both. Sarah left the classroom with slumped shoulders, and Emma felt a small pang of doubt. But she pushed it aside. She had been teaching long enough to trust her instincts. This would be good for Sarah. What Emma didn't know was that Sarah carried a secret that would change everything. As Sarah walked through the hallways, she thought about her life outside of school. She thought about her small apartment where she lived with her grandmother. She thought about the elderly upright piano that sat against the living room wall, its keys yellowed with age. And most of all, she thought about the boy who lived in the apartment next door. His name was Daniel Park, and he was 16, the same age as Sarah. But while Sarah attended Riverside High, Daniel was homeschooled due to health issues that had plagued him since childhood. He rarely left his apartment, and most people in the building didn't even know he existed. Sarah had met him by accident 2 years ago, when she had knocked on the wrong door looking for her grandmother. That chance meeting had changed her life. Daniel had invited her in when he heard she was learning piano, and what Sarah discovered in that small, cluttered apartment had amazed her. Daniel wasn't just a piano player. He was a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent who had been accepted to Juilliard at age 12. But a severe illness had derailed his dreams, leaving him isolated at home with only his music for company. Over the past 2 years, Daniel had become Sarah's secret teacher. While she took basic lessons at school, learning proper technique and theory, she spent her evenings next door with Daniel, who taught her the things that couldn't be found in textbooks. He taught her about emotion and interpretation. He taught her about the stories that lived inside the music. He showed her how to make the piano sing. But Sarah had never told anyone about Daniel. His family was intensely private about his condition, and he had asked her to keep their friendship confidential. So at school she played like a mediocre student, never revealing the skills she was developing. She did it to protect Daniel's privacy, and because she felt safer being invisible. Now, walking home with the Rachmaninoff Prelude in her backpack, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and excitement. This was Daniel's favorite piece. He had played it for her dozens of times, explaining every nuance and emotion. He had once told her that this piece was like a storm of the soul, powerful and overwhelming. When she reached her apartment building, Sarah didn't go to her own door. Instead, she knocked on Daniel's. She heard the familiar sound of locks being undone, and then the door opened to reveal a thin boy with dark circles under his eyes but a warm smile on his face. Sarah held up the sheet music, and Daniel's eyes widened. Without a word, he stepped aside to let her in. His piano, a beautiful grand that somehow fit in the small living room, waited in the corner. Daniel's mother was at work and his father was running errands. They had the apartment to themselves. Sarah explained what had happened at school, how her teacher had given her this impossible piece, expecting her to fail or maybe to try her best and produce something mediocre. Daniel listened carefully, his fingers unconsciously moving as if playing an invisible keyboard. When Sarah finished talking, Daniel sat at his piano and began to play the Rachmaninoff Prelude. The music filled the small apartment, powerful and haunting. Sarah watched his hands move across the keys with impossible grace and speed. This was why he had been destined for greatness. This was the talent that illness had stolen from the world. When he finished, Daniel turned to Sarah with a serious expression. He told her that they had 3 months, which was enough time. He would teach her this piece properly, not just the notes but the soul of it. But there was one condition. She had to promise him that when she performed it, she would play with everything she had. No more hiding. No more being invisible. Sarah felt her heart racing. What Daniel was asking went against everything she had been doing at school. But as she looked at his earnest face, she realized he was right. It was time to stop hiding. She agreed, and Daniel smiled. They began that very afternoon, starting with just the first page. Sarah quickly realized that learning this piece would be the hardest thing she had ever done. But with Daniel beside her, patiently correcting and encouraging, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt hope. The first week was brutal. Sarah spent every afternoon after school at Daniel's apartment, her fingers stumbling over passages that seemed impossible to master. The Rachmaninoff Prelude demanded not just technical skill but enormous hand strength and endurance. There were moments when Sarah wanted to give up, to march back to Mrs. Martinez and beg for a different piece. But Daniel never let her quit. At school, the other students had started to notice Sarah's assignment. During lunch breaks, she overheard their conversations. Some felt sorry for her, believing Mrs. Martinez had made a cruel mistake. Others laughed, making bets about how badly she would embarrass herself at the recital. Rebecca, the star student, had even approached her once with false sympathy, offering to ask Mrs. Martinez to switch their pieces. Sarah declined politely, though inside she felt humiliated. She understood why they all thought she would fail. In class, she still played like a mediocre student because she had to maintain her cover. Mrs. Martinez had no idea about Daniel or the hours of intensive practice happening next door. As far as the teacher knew, Sarah was struggling alone with a piece far beyond her abilities. During piano class, Mrs. Martinez would check on each student's progress. When she reached Sarah, there was always a moment of awkward silence. Sarah would play a simplified version of the opening bars, deliberately making small mistakes. Mrs. Martinez would sigh, offer some basic corrections, and move on to the next student. Sarah could see the disappointment in her teacher's eyes, and it hurt more than she expected. But in Daniel's apartment, a different story was unfolding. Daniel was a patient teacher, but he was also demanding. He had learned from the best instructors in the world during his brief time at Juilliard, and he applied those same rigorous standards to Sarah. He taught her exercises to strengthen her hands and wrists. He made her practice difficult passages at impossibly slow tempos until every note was perfect. Then he gradually increased the speed day by day until her fingers could fly across the keys. Daniel explained the history of the piece to Sarah. Rachmaninoff had composed it when he was 19, and it had made him famous overnight. The piece opened with 3 heavy, ominous chords that sounded like bells tolling. Those chords alone had become iconic in classical music. But the real challenge came in the middle section, where the pianist's hands had to stretch across the keyboard in ways that seemed anatomically impossible. Sarah's hands were smaller than average, which made certain passages even more difficult. Daniel worked with her to find alternate fingerings that would allow her to reach the notes. He showed her how to use the pedal to sustain notes while her hands moved to new positions. These were advanced techniques that most high school students never learned. 3 weeks into their intensive training, something shifted. Sarah was practicing a particularly difficult section when she suddenly felt the music click into place. Her hands knew where to go without her having to think about it. The notes flowed together naturally, creating the cascading effect that Rachmaninoff had intended. She finished the passage and looked up at Daniel with wide eyes. Daniel was grinning. He told her that this was the breakthrough moment every pianist experienced. The piece was becoming part of her, living in her muscle memory. From this point forward, progress would accelerate. She was no longer fighting the music. She was beginning to understand it, but understanding the notes was only half the battle. Daniel spent the next sessions teaching Sarah about interpretation. The Rachmaninoff Prelude wasn't just a technical showcase. It was a deeply emotional piece that told a story. Different pianists interpreted that story in different ways, and Sarah needed to find her own interpretation. Daniel played recordings of famous performances, pointing out how each pianist brought their own personality to the piece. Some played it like a thunderstorm, powerful and aggressive. Others played it like a lament, sorrowful and introspective. He asked Sarah what the music meant to her. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the music in her head. She thought about her own life, about feeling invisible at school, about watching Daniel's dreams get stolen by illness. She realized that to her, the piece was about hidden strength. It was about the power that existed beneath quiet surfaces. When she shared this with Daniel, he nodded with approval. That would be her interpretation. At school, Mrs. Martinez was growing concerned. The recital was now less than 2 months away, and Sarah showed no signs of improvement. The teacher had started to seriously consider pulling Sarah from the performance to save her from public humiliation. She scheduled a meeting with Sarah during lunch period to discuss alternatives. Sarah sat across from Mrs. Martinez in the empty classroom, her heart pounding. The teacher spoke kindly but firmly. She acknowledged that perhaps the Rachmaninoff had been too ambitious. She suggested that Sarah could perform a simpler piece instead, something that would showcase her actual abilities without setting her up for failure. There was no shame in knowing one's limitations. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. These were the same words people had probably said to Daniel when he got sick. That he should accept his limitations. That he should give up on his dreams. She thought about all the hours she had spent practicing, all the progress she had made. She thought about Daniel's faith in her. Looking Mrs. Martinez in the eye, Sarah declined the offer to switch pieces. She said she wanted to perform the Rachmaninoff as assigned. Her voice was quiet but firm. Mrs. Martinez seemed surprised by this show of determination. After a moment of consideration, she agreed, but warned Sarah that she needed to show significant improvement in class, or she would be pulled from the recital for her own good. That evening, Sarah arrived at Daniel's apartment fighting back tears of frustration. She felt trapped between 2 worlds. At school, she had to continue playing poorly to protect Daniel's secret. But if she didn't show some improvement, she wouldn't be allowed to perform at all. It seemed like an impossible situation. Daniel listened to her problem with a thoughtful expression. Then he suggested something unexpected. What if she showed just enough improvement to keep Mrs. Martinez satisfied, but not so much that it would raise questions? She could reveal her abilities gradually, making it seem like she was working very hard and making slow progress. It wouldn't be the truth, but it would buy them the time they needed. Sarah agreed to the plan. The next day in class, when Mrs. Martinez checked her progress, Sarah played better than she had before but still made deliberate mistakes. She stumbled over passages she could actually play perfectly. She pretended to struggle with sections she had already mastered. It was like performing 2 different roles, and Sarah discovered she had a talent for deception. Mrs. Martinez seemed encouraged by the slight improvement. She gave Sarah additional tips and suggested extra practice strategies, unaware that Sarah was already practicing 3 hours every day with a teacher far more skilled than she was. The plan was working. As the weeks continued, Daniel pushed Sarah harder. They worked on the emotional dynamics of the piece, the way it swelled and receded like ocean waves. They practiced the famous opening chords until Sarah could make them ring with perfect resonance. They worked on the softer sections where the music became almost a whisper, requiring delicate control. Daniel's health fluctuated during this time. Some days he was energetic and focused. Other days Sarah would arrive to find him exhausted, barely able to sit at the piano. On those difficult days, she would play for him instead, and he would listen from the couch calling out corrections and encouragement. Sarah realized that teaching her had given Daniel a new purpose. He was living his dreams through her performance. One evening, about 6 weeks into their preparation, Daniel asked Sarah to play the entire piece from beginning to end without stopping. This would be the first time she attempted a complete run-through. Sarah sat at his piano, took a deep breath, and began. The opening chords rang out heavy and ominous. Her hands moved into the rushing passages that followed, fingers flying across the keys. She made a few small mistakes but kept going. The music built to the powerful middle section, where her hands stretched across the keyboard in ways that had seemed impossible weeks earlier. Then it softened into the lyrical section, delicate and haunting. Finally, it built to the crashing conclusion, ending with those same heavy chords that had opened the piece. When Sarah finished, her hands were shaking from the exertion. She turned to look at Daniel, afraid of what she might see on his face. But Daniel was standing now, tears streaming down his cheeks. He told her that it was beautiful. She hadn't just played the notes. She had played the soul of the piece. She was ready. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and terror. The recital was only 3 weeks away. Soon everyone would know the truth about what she could do. There would be no more hiding. The school auditorium was already buzzing with activity when Sarah arrived for the final dress rehearsal. It was 3 days before the recital, and all the students would perform their pieces in front of an empty auditorium to work out any technical problems. Mrs. Martinez stood near the stage, checking her clipboard and coordinating with the sound technician. Sarah found a seat in the back row, trying to calm her racing heart. She had been dreading this moment for weeks. During class practices, she had been able to maintain her deception, playing just well enough to keep Mrs. Martinez from pulling her from the program. But a dress rehearsal meant playing the entire piece, and she would have to make a choice: continue to hide her abilities or reveal the truth. The night before, she had talked it through with Daniel. He had been firm in his advice. The deception had served its purpose, but now it was time to be honest. If she played poorly at the dress rehearsal, Mrs. Martinez might still pull her from the recital. And even if she didn't, Sarah would be doing herself a disservice. She had worked too hard to pretend otherwise, but Sarah was terrified. She had spent so long being invisible, being the quiet girl that nobody noticed. The thought of suddenly becoming the center of attention made her feel sick. She told Daniel that she wasn't sure she could do it. What if people thought she had been deceiving them all along? What if they were angry? What if Mrs. Martinez felt insulted that Sarah hadn't trusted her? Daniel had taken her hands in his and spoken seriously. He told her that fear was natural, but it couldn't control her choices. He had spent 2 years hiding in his apartment, afraid to let anyone see what his illness had done to him. He had let fear trap him. He didn't want Sarah to make the same mistake. Playing this piece at the recital was her chance to step into the light. She needed to be brave enough to take it. Now, sitting in the auditorium, Sarah remembered those words. She watched as other students took their turns on stage. Rebecca played her Chopin etude flawlessly, as expected. Marcus brought energy and personality to his jazz piece. Each student performed well, and the audience of their peers applauded politely. Finally, Mrs. Martinez called Sarah's name. Sarah stood on shaky legs and walked down the aisle toward the stage. She could hear whispers following her. Everyone knew she had been given the impossible piece. They were waiting to see how badly she would fail. Sarah climbed the steps to the stage and sat at the beautiful grand piano positioned at center stage. The lights were hot and bright. She adjusted the bench, positioned her hands over the keys, and closed her eyes. She thought about Daniel, about everything he had taught her. She thought about the story she wanted to tell through this music. She thought about hidden strength and quiet power. Then she began to play. The opening chords rang through the auditorium, perfect and powerful. Sarah moved into the rushing passages that followed, her fingers moving with confidence and precision. In the audience, the whispers stopped. People leaned forward in their seats. Mrs. Martinez, who had been making notes on her clipboard, looked up sharply. Sarah was completely focused on the music now. She wasn't thinking about the audience or what anyone thought. She was lost in the piece, feeling every emotion it contained. Her hands stretched across the keyboard in the difficult middle section without hesitation. The notes cascaded like a waterfall, exactly as Rachmaninoff had intended. The music softened into the lyrical section, and Sarah played with such delicate control that people held their breath, afraid to break the spell. Then it built again to the powerful conclusion, ending with those heavy resonant chords that made the auditorium seem to shake. When Sarah finished, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the auditorium erupted. Students were on their feet, applauding and shouting. Some were laughing in disbelief. Others were shaking their heads in amazement. Sarah sat at the piano, stunned, as the reality of what had just happened washed over her. Mrs. Martinez was walking toward the stage, her face showing complete shock. She climbed the steps and approached Sarah, who stood up from the piano bench nervously. The teacher stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah couldn't read her expression. When Mrs. Martinez finally spoke, her voice was tight with emotion. She asked Sarah where that performance had come from. She wanted to know why Sarah had been hiding such extraordinary talent. This level of playing didn't develop in a few weeks. Someone had been teaching her and teaching her well. She demanded to know who. Sarah felt panic rising. She couldn't tell Mrs. Martinez about Daniel. She had promised to protect his privacy. But she also couldn't lie anymore. The deception had gone on long enough. She took a deep breath and told Mrs. Martinez that she had a private teacher outside of school, someone very talented who had been working with her for a long time. She couldn't reveal who it was because her teacher valued privacy, but she could assure Mrs. Martinez that everything had been done properly. Mrs. Martinez's expression was hard to read. She seemed hurt that Sarah hadn't trusted her with this information. She seemed confused about why a student with such obvious talent would hide it. But she also seemed impressed, despite her complicated feelings. She told Sarah that they would need to have a longer conversation about this later. For now, she wanted Sarah to know that her performance had been extraordinary. The rest of the rehearsal passed in a blur. Other students kept approaching Sarah, asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Rebecca, the star student who had always looked down on her, seemed particularly disturbed. She asked Sarah point blank if she had been playing poorly on purpose all semester. Sarah didn't know what to say. When rehearsal ended, Sarah practically ran from the auditorium. She needed to talk to Daniel. She needed his advice on how to handle the situation she had created. As she hurried through the parking lot toward home, she heard someone calling her name. She turned to find Marcus, the jazz piano student, jogging to catch up with her. He had a friendly smile on his face. He told her that her performance had been incredible. He also said that he understood why she might want to keep a low profile. Sometimes talented people attracted attention they didn't want. He wouldn't ask questions if she didn't want to answer them. He just wanted her to know that he respected what she could do. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Marcus's kindness was unexpected. She thanked him quietly, and they walked together for a few blocks before going their separate ways. His words had made her feel a little less alone. When Sarah reached Daniel's apartment, she found him waiting anxiously. She had texted him right after her performance, telling him it had gone well, but she knew he would want details. She described everything, from the moment she started playing to Mrs. Martinez's shocked reaction to the other students' responses. Daniel listened with a complicated expression on his face. He was proud of her, that much was clear. But Sarah could see something else there too, something that looked like sadness. When she finished her story, Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her something that made her heart sink. He said that watching her grow and succeed had been one of the best experiences of his life. Teaching her had given him purpose during a very difficult time, but he realized now that he had been selfish. By asking her to keep their lessons secret, he had put her in an impossible position. He had made her lie to her teacher and her classmates. He had let his own need for privacy hurt her relationships at school. Sarah tried to protest, but Daniel held up his hand. He said that after the recital, she should tell Mrs. Martinez the truth. Not his name if he didn't want her to, but the fact that she had been studying seriously for years. She deserved to be recognized for her hard work. She deserved to have teachers who could help her develop her talent fully. And she deserved to do it all without having to hide. Sarah felt conflicted. She understood what Daniel was saying, but she didn't want to betray his trust. She told him that she wouldn't reveal anything he didn't want her to. His privacy was important, and she would respect that. Daniel smiled sadly. He said that maybe it was time for him to stop hiding too. He had spent 2 years in this apartment, afraid to let anyone see him. He had convinced himself that his worth was tied to his ability to perform, and when illness took that away, he felt like he had nothing left to offer the world. But teaching Sarah had shown him that there were other ways to be valuable. He could share his knowledge. He could help others grow. Maybe that was enough. Sarah didn't know what to say. She reached out and hugged Daniel, and they stayed like that for a long time. She realized that this journey hadn't just been about her learning to play difficult music. It had been about both of them learning to be brave enough to be seen. The next few days at school were strange. Word had spread about Sarah's dress rehearsal performance. Students she had never spoken to approached her in the hallways. Some wanted to know her secret. Others just wanted to say they were looking forward to the recital. A few seemed angry, as if she had played a trick on them by hiding her abilities. Mrs. Martinez called Sarah into her office for a private conversation. The teacher's manner was professional but firm. She said that she had done some thinking about the situation. While she was impressed by Sarah's talent, she was troubled by the deception. The night of the recital arrived with perfect spring weather. The auditorium began filling up an hour before the performance was scheduled to start. Parents, friends, and family members filed into the rows of seats, creating a buzz of conversation. Sarah peeked out from backstage and felt her stomach drop. She had never performed in front of so many people before. The other students were gathered in the green room, a space behind the stage where they could wait for their turns to perform. Some were doing last-minute practice on silent keyboards. Others were reviewing their sheet music one final time. Rebecca sat in a corner, looking calm and composed as always. Marcus was joking around with some other students, trying to ease the tension. And Sarah sat alone, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Martinez had arranged the program so that students would perform in order of difficulty, saving the most challenging pieces for the end. That meant Sarah would be one of the last performers. She would have to sit through nearly 2 hours of other students' performances before taking the stage herself. The wait felt like torture. Sarah's grandmother had come to watch, sitting in the third row with a proud smile on her face. She knew about Daniel, though she had never met him. Sarah had confided in her grandmother weeks ago, needing at least one person to understand what she was going through. Her grandmother had been supportive, though she had warned Sarah that secrets had a way of coming out eventually. As Sarah sat backstage, nervously tapping her foot, she felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. It was a text from Daniel. He had written that he wished he could be there to watch her perform. He told her to remember everything they had worked on. Most importantly, he reminded her to tell her story through the music. The technical perfection didn't matter as much as the emotion. She should play from her heart. Sarah smiled at the message and felt some of her nervousness fade. Daniel had given her so much over the past months. Not just piano lessons, but confidence and purpose. Whatever happened tonight, she was grateful for that. The recital began right on time. The first student, a nervous freshman, performed a simple Mozart sonata. She made a few mistakes but received warm applause from the supportive audience. One by one, students took the stage, each performing their assigned pieces with varying degrees of success. Sarah watched them through a gap in the curtain, trying to distract herself from her own growing anxiety. Marcus performed his jazz piece with flair and personality, getting one of the biggest rounds of applause so far. He came backstage grinning, clearly pleased with how it had gone. He caught Sarah's eye and gave her an encouraging thumbs up. She appreciated the gesture more than he probably knew. Rebecca performed her Chopin etude near the end of the program. As expected, it was technically flawless. Every note was precise, every phrase perfectly shaped. The audience applauded enthusiastically. Rebecca returned backstage looking satisfied. She glanced at Sarah as she passed, and Sarah couldn't quite read the expression on her face. Was it curiosity? Competitiveness? Maybe a little bit of both. Then Mrs. Martinez was at Sarah's side, telling her it was time. Sarah stood up on shaky legs. Mrs. Martinez studied her face for a moment, then spoke quietly. She told Sarah that regardless of what happened tonight, she wanted her to know that she was proud of her. Sarah had worked harder than any student she had taught in years. That dedication deserved recognition, no matter how the performance went. Sarah felt tears threaten to well up, but she blinked them back. She thanked Mrs. Martinez and walked toward the stage entrance. She could hear Mrs. Martinez introducing her to the audience, explaining that Sarah would be performing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one of the most demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Sarah walked onto the stage, and the bright lights hit her immediately. The auditorium looked enormous from up here, filled with hundreds of faces all turned toward her. She could see her grandmother in the third row, beaming with pride. She could see other students' families looking curious about this performance they had heard rumors about. She sat at the grand piano and adjusted the bench, going through her familiar routine. She positioned her hands over the keys and took a deep breath. In that moment of silence before she began, Sarah thought about everything that had led her to this point. She thought about meeting Daniel by chance 2 years ago. She thought about the hundreds of hours they had spent working together. She thought about his illness and his lost dreams. She thought about her own journey from invisibility to this moment in the spotlight. And then she began to play. The opening chords rang out, heavy and powerful, exactly as she had practiced them 1,000 times. The audience immediately fell silent, recognizing the iconic opening of the piece. Sarah moved into the rushing passages that followed, her fingers flying across the keys with confidence. She wasn't thinking about technique anymore. She was thinking about the story she wanted to tell. This was a piece about hidden depths, about the power that existed beneath quiet surfaces. That was true for her, and it was true for Daniel. It was true for anyone who had ever felt invisible or overlooked. The music swelled and built, expressing all those feelings of frustration and strength. Sarah's hand stretched across the keyboard in the difficult middle section, reaching notes that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. The audience watched in amazement as this quiet girl who nobody had paid attention to commanded the piano with such authority. Parents who had come expecting a typical student recital were sitting forward in their seats, realizing they were witnessing something special. Mrs. Martinez stood at the side of the stage, her hand over her mouth. She had known Sarah had improved, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. This wasn't just a competent performance. This was the kind of playing that belonged in a concert hall. Where had this girl been hiding all semester? And more importantly, who had taught her to play like this? The music shifted into the lyrical middle section, becoming soft and delicate. Sarah played with such control that the auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Every note was clear and perfectly weighted. Then the music began building again, growing in power and intensity until it reached the crashing conclusion. Sarah played the final chords with all the strength she had, making them ring through the auditorium. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the auditorium erupted. People jumped to their feet, applauding wildly. Sarah sat at the piano, breathing hard, hardly able to believe what had just happened. Her grandmother was crying and clapping. Other audience members were shaking their heads in amazement. Some were turning to their neighbors, asking who this girl was and where she had come from. Sarah stood and took a bow, her legs still shaking. She walked off the stage to thunderous applause that continued even after she disappeared behind the curtain. Backstage, the other students stared at her with a mixture of awe and shock. Even Rebecca looked impressed, though she seemed reluctant to admit it. Mrs. Martinez approached Sarah with tears streaming down her face. She pulled Sarah into a tight hug, something she had never done with a student before. When she pulled back, she told Sarah that in 15 years of teaching she had never heard a student play like that. She demanded to know who had been teaching her, because that teacher was clearly exceptional. Sarah knew this moment was coming. She had rehearsed what she would say. She told Mrs. Martinez that her teacher was someone who valued privacy very much. She asked if it would be okay to bring him to meet Mrs. Martinez privately after the recital was over. She promised that everything would be explained. Mrs. Martinez seemed frustrated by the continued mystery, but she agreed. The recital had to continue, and there were still a few students left to perform. But after everything was finished, they would talk. The remaining performances seemed to pass in a blur. Sarah barely registered them, still coming down from the adrenaline of her own performance. When the recital finally ended, families began filing out of the auditorium, but many stopped to speak with Mrs. Martinez, asking about the girl who had played the Rachmaninoff. Who was she? Had she won competitions? Why hadn't they heard of her before? Mrs. Martinez handled these questions gracefully while scanning the crowd for Sarah. Finally, she saw her standing near the exit with her grandmother. Sarah caught her eye and nodded toward the door. Mrs. Martinez told the remaining parents she needed to step away and followed Sarah outside. In the parking lot, Sarah walked toward a car that was idling near the curb. Mrs. Martinez followed, confused. Sarah opened the back door and helped someone out. It was a thin teenage boy, moving carefully. He was dressed nicely as if for an important occasion, but he looked exhausted, like the effort of getting dressed and coming here had drained him. Sarah introduced him as Daniel Park. She explained that Daniel had been her teacher for the past 2 years. Before Mrs. Martinez could ask questions, Sarah continued with Daniel's story. She explained about Juilliard, about his illness, about the dreams that had been taken from him. She explained how she had met him by chance and how he had given her the gift of his knowledge and experience. Mrs. Martinez stared at Daniel for a long moment. Then recognition dawned on her face. She said his name slowly, as if trying to place it. The Monday after the recital, Sarah walked through the halls of Riverside High and felt like she was living in a different world. Students she had never spoken to before stopped her to offer congratulations. Teachers who didn't even teach music mentioned her performance. The school's social media pages had been flooded with videos that parents had recorded on their phones, and Sarah's performance had been shared hundreds of times. The attention was overwhelming. Sarah had spent so long being invisible that she didn't know how to handle suddenly being seen by everyone. Some of the comments online were incredibly positive, with people saying she should pursue music professionally. Others were more skeptical, with a few suggesting that she must have somehow cheated or that the recording had been edited. Sarah tried not to read the comments, but it was hard to look away. In piano class that day, the atmosphere was different. Mrs. Martinez addressed the class before they began, acknowledging that the recital had been a success. She specifically mentioned Sarah's performance, calling it exceptional and noting that it had set a new standard for what was possible. Several students glanced at Sarah, who felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Rebecca raised her hand and asked a question that Sarah knew was coming. She wanted to know if it was fair that Sarah had been receiving outside instruction when the recital was supposed to showcase what students learned in class. Her tone wasn't hostile, but there was an edge to it. She had been the star student all year, and now someone had upstaged her. Mrs. Martinez handled the question diplomatically. She explained that many students received supplementary instruction outside of school, whether through private lessons, online tutorials, or family members who played instruments. That was not against any rules. What mattered was that students completed their assignments and demonstrated growth. Sarah had done both. In fact, she had taken on a more challenging assignment than anyone else and had risen to meet it. Rebecca didn't look entirely satisfied with this answer, but she didn't push further. After class, however, she approached Sarah directly. Sarah braced herself for a confrontation, but Rebecca's expression was more curious than angry. She asked Sarah point blank why she had been pretending to be mediocre all semester. What was the point? Sarah struggled to explain. She told Rebecca that she hadn't been pretending, not exactly. She had been trying to keep someone's privacy protected. It wasn't about tricking anyone or making them look bad. Rebecca studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She said she guessed she could understand that, though it must have been weird to constantly hold back. Then, surprising Sarah, she added that the performance had been genuinely impressive. Rebecca had been playing piano since she was 5, and she recognized real talent when she saw it. The compliment from Rebecca felt significant. Sarah thanked her quietly, and some of the tension between them dissolved. They would probably never be close friends, but at least they had reached an understanding. Later that week, Mrs. Martinez arranged for Sarah and Daniel to meet with her and the school's music department head, Mr. Thompson. The meeting took place after school in a small conference room. Daniel arrived looking nervous, and Sarah could see the effort it took for him to be there. Social situations exhausted him quickly due to his condition, but he had insisted on coming. Mr. Thompson was a kind man in his 60s who had dedicated his life to music education. He greeted Daniel with obvious respect. mentioning that he had followed Daniel's early career with interest. He said it was an honor to meet him, even under these unusual circumstances. Daniel seemed embarrassed by the attention but handled it gracefully. The meeting was productive. They discussed Sarah's future in the music program and what additional opportunities might be available to her. Mr. Thompson mentioned several prestigious competitions that Sarah might consider entering. He also talked about music scholarships and conservatory programs that she should start thinking about, even though she was only a sophomore. Daniel contributed valuable insights about what Sarah needed to continue developing her skills. He suggested specific areas where she should focus her practice and mentioned techniques that had helped him when he was her age. Mrs. Martinez took notes, occasionally asking questions. Sarah watched the three adults discuss her musical education and felt a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety. This was becoming real. People were talking about her future as a serious pianist. Toward the end of the meeting, Mr. Thompson made a proposal that surprised everyone. He suggested that Daniel might consider doing some teaching at the school, perhaps offering a master class or mentoring advanced students. It wouldn't be a full-time position, and they would work around his health limitations. But his expertise was too valuable not to share with more students. Daniel looked shocked by the suggestion. He said he would need to think about it, but he appreciated the offer. After the meeting, as Sarah walked with him to his mother's car, Daniel admitted that he hadn't expected anyone to want him involved. He had assumed his illness had made him irrelevant to the music world. The fact that people still valued his knowledge meant more to him than Sarah probably realized. Over the following weeks, videos of Sarah's performance continued to circulate online. A local news station even did a short segment about her, interviewing Mrs. Martinez and playing clips from the recital. The reporter called Sarah a hidden prodigy and suggested she might have a bright future in classical music. Sarah watched the segment with her grandmother, feeling surreal about seeing herself on television. The attention brought unexpected opportunities. A prestigious summer music program invited Sarah to apply for a scholarship. A music professor from a nearby university reached out to Mrs. Martinez, expressing interest in working with Sarah. Several local venues asked if she would consider performing at community events. It was exciting but also overwhelming. Through it all, Daniel remained Sarah's anchor. They still met regularly at his apartment, though now their sessions focused less on technical practice and more on repertoire building and performance preparation. Daniel helped Sarah select pieces for her next recital and guided her through the process of recording applications for the summer program. But Sarah noticed that something had changed in Daniel. He seemed more energized than he had been in months. The prospect of teaching at the school had sparked something in him. He told Sarah that he had been thinking seriously about Mr. Thompson's offer. Teaching her had shown him that he could still be part of the music world, just in a different way than he had originally planned. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and start contributing again. Sarah encouraged him, though she worried about whether his health would allow it. Daniel assured her that he would be careful and would only take on what he could handle. But he wanted to try. He was tired of letting fear control his life. A month after the recital, Daniel accepted Mr. Thompson's offer. He would teach a small master class for advanced piano students once a week, working with students individually on interpretation and advanced techniques. The school would provide transportation and allow him to take breaks as needed. It was a small step, but it felt significant. The first master class was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Sarah attended along with Rebecca, Marcus, and 3 other advanced students. They gathered in the music room, not quite knowing what to expect. When Daniel arrived, walking slowly and leaning on his mother's arm, Sarah could see the nervousness on his face. But once he sat down at the piano and began to talk about music, the nervousness faded. This was what he was meant to do. Daniel asked each student to play something for him, then offered feedback that was detailed and insightful. He didn't just point out technical errors. He talked about the emotional content of the music and how to communicate it to an audience. He demonstrated passages on the piano, his hands moving with that same effortless grace that had first amazed Sarah 2 years ago. The students were captivated. Even Rebecca, who rarely seemed impressed by anyone, listened intently to everything Daniel said. When the session ended, several students lingered to ask additional questions. Daniel answered them patiently, and Sarah could see how happy he was to be doing this work. Over the next few weeks, word spread about Daniel's master classes. More students asked if they could attend. Parents inquired about private lessons, though Daniel had to explain that his health limited how much he could take on. But within the school's music program, he became a valued presence. Students who had never met him knew his story, and they respected both his talent and his courage in coming out of isolation to teach. For Sarah, having Daniel at school was both wonderful and strange. She had to share him now with other students, which sometimes felt difficult. But she also saw how teaching multiple students brought him joy. He was building a new kind of career, different from the one he had lost but valuable in its own way. One afternoon, Mrs. Martinez asked Sarah to stay after class. She wanted to discuss something important. Sarah sat down nervously, wondering what was coming. Mrs. Martinez began by saying that Sarah's performance at the recital had fundamentally changed her perspective as a teacher. She had assigned the Rachmaninoff prelude expecting Sarah to struggle or fail, intending it as a tough love motivation technique. Preparing to perform a piano concerto with an orchestra was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. She had to learn not just her own part, but how to listen to the other instruments and coordinate with them. She had to understand when to lead and when to follow. She had to develop a completely new set of skills. Mrs. Martinez and Daniel worked together to help Sarah prepare. They selected the first movement of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21, a piece that was challenging but beautiful, with sections that would showcase Sarah's technical abilities and her musicality. Daniel worked with her on the solo passages, while Mrs. Martinez helped her understand how to fit her playing within the larger orchestral context. The school orchestra met twice a week for rehearsals. Sarah attended every session, sitting in the back at first just to listen and understand how the piece fit together. The orchestra consisted mostly of students, though there were a few adult volunteers who played more challenging parts. The conductor, Ms. Chen, was a serious woman who demanded excellence from her musicians but had a kind heart underneath her strict exterior. When it came time for Sarah to rehearse with the orchestra for the first time, she felt more nervous than she had before the recital. This wasn't just about her anymore. She was one part of a larger whole, and if she made mistakes, it would affect everyone. She sat at the piano, her hands trembling slightly as Ms. Chen raised her baton. The orchestra began playing the opening, and Sarah waited for her entrance. When the moment came, she began playing, but immediately she felt lost. The sound of all the instruments around her was overwhelming. She couldn't hear herself properly. She missed her entrance in the next section and had to stop, embarrassed. Ms. Chen lowered her baton and looked at Sarah kindly. She explained that playing with an orchestra took adjustment. Sarah needed to trust her ears and not worry so much about hearing every note she played. The piano would project into the auditorium even if it didn't sound loud on stage. They would practice the difficult entrances slowly until Sarah felt comfortable. They spent the next hour working through the piece section by section. Gradually, Sarah began to understand how to navigate playing with the orchestra. She learned to listen for certain instruments that would cue her entrances. She learned to match the orchestra's dynamics and tempo. It was like learning a new language, but slowly she started to speak it fluently. After that first full rehearsal, Sarah met with Daniel to work on the sections that had been difficult. Daniel had experience performing concertos, even though that felt like a lifetime ago to him now. He gave her practical advice about stage positioning, about how to communicate with the conductor through subtle movements, about managing her energy across a longer piece. His insights were invaluable. As the weeks passed, Sarah's confidence grew. The orchestra rehearsals became less intimidating and more exciting. She developed a rapport with Ms. Chen and with some of the other orchestra members. Marcus, who played trumpet in the orchestra, often encouraged her during breaks. Even some of the older students, who had initially been skeptical about a sophomore being featured as soloist, warmed up to her as they heard her improving. But not everything was going smoothly. Daniel's health, which had been relatively stable for months, began to decline. He was taking on too much, teaching his master class every week in addition to his intensive sessions with Sarah. Some days when Sarah arrived for their practice time, she would find him so exhausted he could barely sit upright. His mother expressed concern that he was pushing himself too hard. Sarah felt guilty. She worried that preparing her for this concert was taking too much out of Daniel. She offered to work with just Mrs. Martinez for a while to give him time to rest. But Daniel refused. He told her that this work was giving his life meaning. Yes, he was tired, but it was a good tired. It was the exhaustion that came from pursuing something worthwhile. He didn't want to stop. Still, Sarah made sure to be more mindful during their sessions. She came prepared with specific questions rather than needing Daniel to guide every aspect of practice. She learned to read when he was having a particularly difficult day and would keep those sessions shorter. She brought him tea and made sure he took breaks. In some ways, their roles reversed a little. She became the one taking care of him, just as he had taken care of her musical development. One afternoon, about 3 weeks before the end-of-year concert, Sarah arrived at Daniel's apartment to find his mother waiting outside. She looked worried and told Sarah that Daniel had been admitted to the hospital that morning. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but his doctors wanted to run tests and monitor him. He had been overexerting himself and his body had protested. Sarah felt her heart sink. She asked if she could visit him, and Daniel's mother said she would check with the hospital. The next day, she got permission and Sarah took the bus across town to the medical center where Daniel was staying. She found him in a private room, looking small in the hospital bed connected to various monitors. But his eyes lit up when he saw her. Daniel apologized for missing their practice session. Sarah told him not to be ridiculous. His health was far more important than any concert. But Daniel disagreed. He said the concert was important and they needed to make sure she was ready for it. Even from a hospital bed, he wanted to talk through the tricky sections and discuss interpretation. Sarah spent an hour with him, and they did talk about music, though she tried to keep it light and not too demanding. When visiting hours ended, Daniel made her promise that she would continue preparing for the concert even if he couldn't be there for every session. She had come so far, and this opportunity was too significant to waste, Sarah promised, though she felt uncertain about doing it without him. Over the next week, Sarah worked primarily with Mrs. Martinez. The teacher stepped up admirably, using techniques Daniel had taught and adding her own insights. But Sarah missed Daniel's presence, his unique perspective, the way he could hear things in her playing that no one else noticed. She visited him every few days, updating him on her progress and seeking his advice on specific passages. Daniel's doctors told him he needed to stay in the hospital for at least 2 more weeks. That would take them right up to the week of the concert. Sarah tried to hide her disappointment, but Daniel saw through it. He told her that he would do everything possible to be there for the performance, even if he couldn't help with the final preparations. Wild horses couldn't keep him away from seeing her perform this concerto. The final week before the concert was intense. The orchestra had additional rehearsals to perfect the timing and balance. Ms. Chen worked with Sarah on stage presence and how to acknowledge the audience and the orchestra before and after the performance. Mrs. Martinez helped her select appropriate concert attire and discussed the mental preparation needed for a performance of this magnitude. Sarah's grandmother helped her shop for a dress for the concert. They found a simple but elegant black dress that looked appropriate for a classical performance. As Sarah tried it on in the dressing room, her grandmother teared up, saying she looked so grown up. She told Sarah how proud she was, not just of her musical accomplishments, but of the person she was becoming. Someone who worked hard, who stayed loyal to friends, who faced challenges with courage. 2 days before the concert, Daniel was released from the hospital. He was weak and had to follow strict limitations on his activities, but he was out. His mother drove him to Sarah's apartment that evening, so they could have one final practice session. Sarah was so happy to see him that she almost cried. They spent an hour going through the concerto, with Daniel making small suggestions and offering encouragement. He told her she was ready. More than ready, she was going to be magnificent. The day of the concert arrived with unseasonably warm weather. The performance was scheduled for 7 in the evening, giving Sarah the entire day to prepare mentally. She spent the morning doing light practice at home, not pushing herself but keeping her fingers loose and ready. She had lunch with her grandmother, though she was too nervous to eat much. In the afternoon, she tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. She arrived at the school auditorium 3 hours before the concert was scheduled to begin. The orchestra members were already there, tuning their instruments and doing last-minute preparations. The backstage area hummed with nervous energy. Sarah found a quiet corner and went through her visualization exercises, imagining herself performing perfectly, hearing the music in her mind. Mrs. Martinez checked on her periodically, bringing water and words of encouragement. Ms. Chen gathered the orchestra for a final pep talk, reminding them that they had worked hard and were ready for this moment. She singled out Sarah, saying that the young pianist had shown tremendous dedication and growth, and the orchestra should be proud to share the stage with her. As the audience began filing into the auditorium, Sarah peeked out from behind the curtain. She saw her grandmother taking a seat in the front row. She saw Mrs. Martinez's husband and children finding their seats. She saw students from her classes and their families. The auditorium was filling up quickly, even more crowded than it had been for the spring recital. Then Sarah saw something that made her heart leap. The opening bars of the Mozart concerto floated through the auditorium, the strings creating a gentle, elegant foundation. Sarah waited for her entrance, counting measures in her head, staying perfectly in sync with Ms. Chen's conducting. When the moment came, her hands descended onto the keys and she joined the conversation the orchestra had begun. Everything Daniel had taught her about playing with an orchestra came flooding back. She listened to the violins and matched their tone. She felt the pulse of the cellos and aligned her rhythm with theirs. Her hands moved across the keyboard, with confidence, executing the rapid passages that Mozart had written with crystalline clarity. The piano and orchestra wove together like threads in a tapestry, each part distinct but creating something beautiful together. Sarah felt herself relaxing into the performance. The nervousness she had felt backstage melted away, replaced by the pure joy of making music. This was different from playing alone. This was collaboration, communication, a shared experience with dozens of other musicians all working toward the same goal. She understood now why Daniel had loved performing concertos. There was something magical about being part of something larger than yourself. The first movement of the Mozart concerto had moments of technical brilliance where the piano took center stage, showing off runs and arpeggios that sparkled like light on water. But it also had moments of tenderness, where the piano sang a simple melody while the orchestra provided gentle support. Sarah moved between these moods effortlessly, guided by everything she had learned over the past months. There was a particularly challenging cadenza near the end, a solo section where the orchestra fell silent, and the piano had to carry the entire piece alone. This was the moment Sarah had practiced more than any other, the place where a soloist could truly shine or stumble. As the orchestra stopped playing and all eyes turned to her, Sarah felt a moment of pure clarity. She was ready. Her fingers flew across the keys, executing the elaborate decorations Mozart had written with precision and artistry. The cadenza built and built, growing more complex and exciting until it reached a thrilling climax. Then it resolved elegantly, bringing the audience back to the main theme and signaling the orchestra to rejoin. Ms. Chen brought the orchestra back in perfectly, and together they drove toward the movement's conclusion. The final passages were jubilant and energetic, with the piano and orchestra trading musical phrases back and forth like an animated conversation. Sarah played with abandon now, fully committed to the music, no longer thinking about technique or worrying about mistakes. She was simply playing, expressing, communicating through the language of music. The final chords rang out, and Sarah and the orchestra finished together in perfect unison. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the auditorium exploded with applause. People jumped to their feet immediately, giving Sarah and the orchestra a standing ovation. Sarah stood from the piano bench breathless and beaming. She turned to the orchestra and applauded them, acknowledging their contribution to the performance. Ms. Chen gestured for Sarah to take a solo bow, and she did, her heart soaring as the applause continued. She looked out into the audience and found Daniel. He was standing, though she could see the effort it took, clapping with tears streaming down his face. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, Sarah understood the full significance of what had just happened. This wasn't just her success. It was their shared triumph. Daniel's knowledge and passion for music had found a new voice through her playing. His dreams hadn't died. They had transformed. Sarah bowed again, then walked off stage as the applause continued. Backstage, she was immediately surrounded by orchestra members offering congratulations. Mrs. Martinez hugged her tightly, telling her how proud she was. Ms. Chen shook her hand formally but with a warm smile, saying it had been an honor to conduct for such a talented young soloist. The rest of the concert passed in a blur. There were more pieces performed, but Sarah barely registered them. She sat backstage, still coming down from the adrenaline of her performance, replaying every moment in her mind. When the concert finally ended and the audience began filing out, Sarah made her way to the lobby to find her grandmother and Daniel. Her grandmother reached her first, pulling her into a tight embrace and crying happy tears. She told Sarah that her parents would have been so proud. They had both loved music, and seeing their daughter perform like that would have meant the world to them. Sarah held her grandmother close, feeling grateful for all the support she had received. Then Daniel approached, moving slowly with his mother supporting his arm. He looked exhausted but happier than Sarah had seen him in months. He told her that her performance had been everything he had hoped for and more. She hadn't just played the notes correctly, she had understood the music's soul and communicated it to everyone in that auditorium. That was the mark of a true musician, not just a good student. Sarah thanked him, her voice catching with emotion. She told him that none of this would have been possible without him. He had given her so much more than piano lessons. He had given her confidence, purpose, and a way to express herself that she never knew she needed. She had spent so long feeling invisible, but he had helped her find her voice. Daniel smiled and said that teaching her had saved him just as much as she felt he had saved her. When illness had taken away his ability to perform professionally, he had lost his sense of purpose. He had felt like a failure, like his life's work had been for nothing. But working with Sarah had shown him that there were many ways to contribute to the world of music. Teaching was its own form of artistry, and watching a student grow and succeed brought its own kind of joy. In the weeks following the concert, life began to shift for both Sarah and Daniel in unexpected ways. The concert had been recorded by the school's media department, and excerpts were shared online. Like her recital performance before it, the video spread quickly. Music teachers and professors shared it as an example of excellent student performance. Classical music blogs wrote about the talented young pianist from Riverside High. One video led to another inquiry, and soon Sarah was receiving invitations to perform at various events around the region. A local arts festival wanted her to give a solo recital. A community orchestra asked if she would perform another concerto with them. A music competition announced that they would waive their application fee if she would consider entering. The opportunities seemed endless, and Sarah felt both excited and overwhelmed by them all. Mrs. Martinez helped Sarah navigate these new opportunities, advising which ones to accept and which to politely decline. They didn't want Sarah to become overscheduled or burned out. The goal was to continue developing her skills while maintaining balance in her life. Daniel agreed with this approach, reminding Sarah that music should bring joy, not stress. Quality was more important than quantity when it came to performances. Daniel's own life was transforming as well. His master class at Riverside High had become so popular that the school asked if he would consider teaching a second session. He agreed, though he was careful to schedule sessions in ways that wouldn't overtax his limited energy. Word of his teaching had spread beyond the school, and he began receiving inquiries from other students and even some adults wanting lessons. Daniel's mother was cautious about him taking on too much, but even she could see the positive change in her son. Teaching had given him a reason to engage with life again. He was more energetic on his good days and less depressed on his bad days. The work was demanding, but it was also healing. One afternoon, about 2 months after the concert, Mrs. Martinez called Sarah into her office for a serious conversation. She had been contacted by a representative from a prestigious music conservatory on the East Coast. They had seen the videos of Sarah's performances and were impressed. They wanted to know if Sarah would be interested in applying to their summer intensive program for gifted young musicians. If accepted, she would spend 6 weeks training with some of the best instructors in the country. Sarah's first reaction was excitement, but then doubt crept in. 6 weeks away from home felt like a long time. She would miss time with her grandmother. She would miss her sessions with Daniel, and she worried about the cost. Her grandmother lived on a fixed income, and Sarah knew that programs like this were expensive. Mrs. Martinez addressed each concern. The program offered full scholarships to students with financial need, which Sarah would certainly qualify for. As for being away from home, it was a big step, but it was also an important opportunity. Serious music students often attended these intensive programs to prepare for conservatory auditions and to develop their skills beyond what was possible in a regular school setting. She encouraged Sarah to at least apply and see what happened. That evening, Sarah discussed it with Daniel and her grandmother. Her grandmother was immediately supportive, saying that this was exactly the kind of opportunity Sarah should pursue. It would be hard to have her gone for 6 weeks, but education and growth sometimes required sacrifice. Daniel agreed, adding that the connections Sarah would make at such a program could be invaluable for her future career.